Saints of God, come on, put those hands together. Let's praise him today. Let's praise him. Yes, it's just something about Sunday morning.
Well, said I can't wait. To Sunday morning, to sing and shout, and praise the Lord. Well, tonight, Sunday morning, gather together.
We are in a passage this morning. If you want to go ahead and open your Bible in James chapter 3, if you want to be flipping there. And as you turn there, I just want to remind you where we have been over the last several months. We've been journeying through what we're calling a Believe series campaign. And we have been wrestling with a variety of aspects of belief, from beliefs that we have to behaviors that we should live out to the kinds of people we're becoming. And so today, as we think about this trait of gentleness, I want us to hear these words in James chapter 3, starting in verse 13 and going until verse 18. If you don't have your Bible, the words will be on the screen behind me. James writes, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Show your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace." Let's pray. Father, we're grateful for this morning. We're grateful for the ways in which you have blessed us and been generous to us. We are grateful for the gift of your word, for the ways that you continue to speak to us through these words, the ways that you continue to call us into relationship through these words. And so this morning, as I preach a word, I pray that you would give me the gift of preaching and teaching, and that you would give us all the gift of open hearts, that we would hear your voice, that we would be called into deeper relationship with you, and that because of that relationship, you would transform us more into the image of your Son, Jesus. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen. The summer after my sophomore year, I became friends with a person whose family owned a lake house. Now, this was a new experience for me because growing up, the closest thing my family had to a lake house was one of those blue pools that are plastic and low to the ground that you buy at Kmart. We had that. Later, we upgraded to an above-ground pool. But what I learned quickly is that pool life and lake life were very, very different kinds of lives. And one of my favorite experience that first year was this new experience of lake life called tubing. Now, if you've ever been tubing before, it's basically you laying down on an inner tube that's hooked up to a boat, and that boat moves through the water and slowly pulls you along the surface of the water. If you have a good driver, they move slowly along the surface of the water. Some of you who have pulled me at encampment before, not such slow drivers, but that's okay. The first time I did this, though, it was an amazing and fun experience. And every time after that was an amazing and fun experience. I loved tubing. I loved moving across the surface of the water. And if you've ever gone tubing before, then you know that it's really important that you pay attention to other boats on the water. Because other boats can have an impact on your experience, whether you realize it or not. And there's a phrase that I learned that first summer about the impact that other boats can have, and that is the wake of a boat. But what I learned that summer is that every boat has a wake. They have a ripple effect that goes out and around and behind the boat as they move through the water. And so if you're a good boater, you really need to pay attention to the ripple effect, the wake of other boats, because it can significantly impact your boating experience and your tubing experience. But to be a really good boater, is not just being aware of the wake of other boats, but it's also realizing that you also leave a wake with your boat. That becoming a good boater, growing into a good boater, at the heart of that is growing in awareness of the ripple effect you leave as you go through the water. And I would argue that when it comes to the life of faith, a similar principle holds true. That part of what it means to grow into a mature follower of Jesus is growing in awareness that you, as you navigate the waters of life, leave a wake all around you. That as you move through the waters of life, there is a ripple effect that impacts others around you. And it's important that if we want to grow more into the image of Jesus, we become more aware of the wake that we leave. And this is why we've been focusing on this question in the last part of this Believe campaign series. This question, who am I becoming? Or another way to say it in light of our example just a second ago, what kind of wake am I leaving? Who am I becoming? What kind of wake am I leaving? And the reason why we've been looking at different aspects of the fruit of the Spirit is that the hope of holding up different aspects and virtues of the fruit of the Spirit each week is that we'll be reminded of the kinds of people that we're called to be. That we'll be reminded of the kind of wake that we're called to leave in the world. That as we navigate through the waters of life, the hope is not that these different virtues, these different aspects of the fruit of the Spirit will simply be conversation pieces, but that they'll be conversion pieces. That we will be converted, we will be changed into men and women who, as we move along and through the waters of life, we will leave a ripple effect. We will leave a wake that reflects the Spirit of God in these particular virtues. Who am I becoming? What kind of wake am I leaving? And these are especially relevant questions for our second to last virtue this morning, that of gentleness. And the reason why I picked this passage in James for us this morning is because I think James gives us particular insight into not just what gentleness is, but also what it's not. Hear these words of James again in James chapter 3. He writes to us this morning, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, and peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown for those who make peace." In our passage this morning, James holds up for us these two paths that we can take with our life. And the first path, he says, is the path of godly wisdom. It is the good path. It is the better way to live. And he says that if we choose to live this life of good works, then we will do good works with gentleness born of wisdom from above. The very first word that James uses to describe this better, good way of living that reflects God is the word gentleness. Now, gentleness is a really important word for us to pay attention to here. It's a word that can be translated humility. It can be translated courtesy. It can be translated being considerate. And later on, James is going to try to flesh out the picture of what this kind of life looks like by adding some more words that give us a more full picture of the kind of person he's describing. He's going to use words like peaceable, words like merciful, full of mercy, willing to yield, and not showing partiality. James paints this picture for us this morning of a person who is living this good and better life, and all of the words he uses to describe this person keep other people in mind. In other words, the question for James is never if we will leave a wake with our lives. The question is, what kind of wake will we leave to those people all around us? And what's really important about this word is that James is not the only one to use this word. But the word that he uses here for gentleness is going to get used 10 more times throughout the New Testament. Peter uses it when he's telling Christians how they should interact with non-believers. Paul's going to use it when he talks about how Christians should interact with each other. But maybe most important of all, the very first person to use this word, the root form of this word, is Jesus himself. When Jesus offers what is sometimes called that great invitation in Matthew 11, where he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Peter, Paul, James, all use this word gentleness because they know the first person used the root form of this word. And they know that when it comes to being gentle, Christians should be gentle. We should live with a spirit of gentleness because it is a spirit that reflects the very nature of who Jesus is. It's the way of humility. It's the way of courtesy. It's the way of being considerate, and it's the way that we're called to live as we navigate the waters of life. That there should be a ripple effect, a wake of gentleness all around us. But what's equally as important as paying attention to what James says is the path that we should take, is also paying close attention to what he says is the opposite path. Because it's in paying attention to what he says about the opposite path, we also get further insight into what gentleness really is and what gentleness really is not. Immediately after he describes this good way of gentleness, he says there is this other kind of life we can live. And there's two key words and phrases that he uses to describe this alternate path. The words selfish ambition and bitter envy. Bitter envy and selfish ambition are this other way that we can choose to move through the world. It's this way that is filled with jealousy and envy and selfishness and self-centeredness. And James says that's another way that we can move through the world. And what James says about the wake that kind of person leaves is not going to surprise any of us who have ever been around a person who's really selfish and really envious and really jealous. Because what he says is that the person who moves through life that way is going to leave a wake of chaos and disorder and wickedness wherever they go. Imagine a boat moving through the waters as if they were the only person on the lake. And they're just moving through the water, completely disregarding that anyone else is out there. The wake that this person's going to leave is going to be quite choppy and quite chaotic. Or if you're not a boat person, imagine that you're driving down the road this afternoon and in your rearview mirror coming down the highway is the most selfish driver to ever take the wheel. You would probably get out of their way, right? Because you know that they're going to be moving through traffic aggressively and violently, and they are going to potentially leave a wake of disorder and chaos wherever they go. This is a person who's kind of like a bull in a china shop. They are not at all concerned with gentleness. They cannot be gentle because all they're doing is creating chaos and disorder. This is not a person who will have a ripple effect of gentleness, but they'll have a ripple effect of violence and aggression. And I intentionally use those words, violence and aggression, this morning, because these are two traits in our world that have become quite normalized. They have become quite acceptable. And most tragic to me is not just when they become acceptable among Christians, but they become advocated by Christians. And sometimes that's really obvious and plain to see. For example, sometimes we talk about working in cutthroat environments. And so what happens when you end up working in a cutthroat environment? You begin behaving in ways that are chaotic, violent, and aggressive. You're doing whatever it takes for you to get ahead. And I'm sure that you can think of some other examples of where we have normalized the spirit of violence and aggression in our world. And we unfortunately keep reaping the consequences of it and those things becoming normal. But sometimes it's not as easy to spot. Sometimes that spirit of violence and aggression is a little more subtle. This is why we sometimes use phrases like passive aggressive. You see, I think it's really significant that in the passage right before this one, James talks about our speech. He talks about how we use our words. He talks about the kinds of words that we speak with our mouth. Because if you've ever been around a passive-aggressive person, you know one of their primary channels is their speech. It's that subtle barb that comes in the side door that catches us off guard and knocks us to our knees. It's the quiet gossip that we speak about other people in order to tear them down. It's that false front of brutal honesty that we use really just to inflict harmful words on another. And now we live in this world where we don't just speak words. We can also type words and post words and tweet words. And we have to pay attention to the ways that those words also can be filled with violence and aggression. It's this false path that James tells us that is not the way of Jesus. It's these virtues and these attributes that do not reflect the Spirit of Jesus at all. Because fundamentally, it's this other path that is self-centered and not other-centered. That's the key distinction I want us to see this morning in these words of James. That distinction right there gets at the heart of gentleness, but also the opposite. Because whenever James talks about gentleness in our passage this morning, and he clusters all of these other words around them, the majority of those words have in mind other people. Mercy, willing to yield, peaceable, not showing partiality. He describes a person that is keeping others in view. But then when he talks about this other path, the words that he uses are fundamentally self-centered. Selfish ambition, envy, and jealousy. This is a person who moves through life who's completely turned in on themselves. And even when they interact with other people, they do so with a spirit of competition and comparison and envy and jealousy. It's still fundamentally about them. That distinction is critical in the wisdom that James gives us this morning. I would say it this way, that the opposite of gentleness is self-centeredness. And the heart of gentleness is other-centeredness. But the opposite of gentleness is self-centeredness, but the heart of gentleness is other-centeredness. Gentleness cannot happen with people who are completely consumed with themselves. Gentleness cannot happen with people who are walking through life thinking everything's about them. People cannot be gentle who are walking through life filled with competition and comparison, and everybody else's story is just a story ultimately about them. That person cannot be gentle with others because it's ultimately all about them. But gentleness can begin to happen when we begin to keep another's perspective in mind. Gentleness can happen when we're willing to step into someone else's shoes and consider something from their perspective. Gentleness can happen if we set our own agenda aside to simply pay attention to where this other person is coming from. That is how gentleness begins to happen. When we begin to release ourselves and we begin to consider others. This past week, I was visiting a member from our church in the hospital. And we were talking about the developments that had led to this individual being placed in the hospital over the last several months. And they gave me a brief recap of what had happened to land them in the hospital. But then they quickly turned to the topic of conversation. And they began to talk about all the other people who had been treating them a certain way in their life. And they talked about two people in particular. The first person they talked about was their boss, who had come from work, come to the hospital room, and reassured them that no matter what, no matter how long they were out of work, they were going to support them and take care of them. And this person was overwhelmed by the kindness and gentleness of their boss to do something like that when they didn't have to. And the second person that they kept talking about was one of their nurses. That there was one nurse in particular who went above and beyond for this patient. Who went above and beyond to show them kindness and compassion and gentleness. And tears filled their eyes as they talked about this gift that they had received from these two different people. And I couldn't help but think about that interaction this week as I was writing this sermon, because what they were describing, this person on the hospital bed, were people who had power over them, had power in their life, and yet they chose to treat them in a certain way. And that's critical for us who want to become gentle people. That no matter how powerful we are, that we choose to use our power in particular ways. Gentle ways, compassionate ways, kind ways. You see, too often we think gentleness means that we're weak or that we're going to be ineffective. But that fundamentally misunderstands gentleness. Gentleness takes so much strength. Gentleness takes so much groundedness in trust in God to choose to treat people a certain way. A gentle way. The Jesus way. Because what I was reminded of this last week by my friend who's in the hospital is that how we treat people will be remembered. People will remember the wake that we leave. They will remember the kind of wake that we leave all around us. So the choice is up to us. Who am I becoming? What kind of wake am I leaving? Am I going to leave a wake of gentleness or not? Choice is ours to make. Let's pray. Father, we're grateful for your Son, Jesus, who shows us what it looks like to be gentle and humble in heart. God, I ask and pray that at the core of who we are, you would help us to become those kinds of people who reflect the gentle and humble way of Jesus as we move through the world. That you would allow us, whether we're interacting with outsiders or we're interacting with people in our church, that you would fill us with the Spirit of Jesus. He teaches us what it looks like to live life to the fullest. And that as we move to this time at the table, that we would see in Jesus someone who, though was God, chose to stoop and to serve and to put others' interests above his own. So as we gather around this table, as we listen to our praise team, as we reflect on the person of Jesus, help us to remember the life we see in Jesus is the life that we're called to live. The wake that we see in Jesus is the wake that we're called to live. We pray these things in his precious name.
Concentrate on the things you learn and obey